with that, we will move now into the Walter Fisher essay on the narrative paradigm, which he's fairly famous for now. What Walter Fisher is doing here is specifically what he's doing is he's kind of extending his theories of narrativity, right? This is like, here's another attempt for me to try to explain and show my theory operating in this particular instance in a scientific paper, right? So whereas with Burke we got in the Literature's Equipment for Living, we could see how proverbs, we can see how stories and so on are rhetorical. Now extend that insight. Now scientific discourses are narrative. To the extent that they are narrative, they are also rhetorical, right? So he's now making this move that we'll see more and more. But basically, it's whereas the early moderns were saying, science and reason and truth and logic are all here, and it's privileged, and that's what we're going to pursue, and all that other stuff, the art stuff, and the feeling stuff, and the body affectation, that gets just all kind of shoved off to the side. Now we are in a place of saying, it's actually the other way around, right? All you guys obsessed with your facts and your reason and your logic and your rationality and so on, you're clueless. You don't realize just how much human values, inform and shape and govern and guide all of that other stuff. All of our scientific inquiry is driven by human fears and desires, and it all kind of comes back to the human, right? And we are not just these kind of rational reasoning machines, as we wanted to believe for a couple hundred years. We are feeling machines. We are irrational machines. We are machines with values, right? And so what Fisher's doing here is, number one, is talking about sort of extending his theories on the narrative paradigm, and doing so by showing how you can bring in the insights of narrative paradigm to something like a scientific paper. It's pretty wild. So what he's showing is you can actually see how, even in the science community, they're doing things that are rhetorical, right? So even science is rhetorical. They're trying to win an audience. They're trying to establish their credibility. They're trying to, position themselves against other audiences and other interpretations and so on. Now, all of these enterprises and activities are rhetorical in the sense that they are, imperfect, partial, on the fly, and so on and so on. So there's lots of really interesting, good stuff in here. I don't want to go, I could spend quite a bit of time going through all the particulars, but I'll just try to hit some of the key stuff. So he says about 6 lines down, the first page there, the present essay is meant to substantiate my claim that the narrative paradigm can account for scientific discourse, that scientific discourse is narrative and therefore rhetorical. He says at the end of that paragraph, I shall maintain that narrative rationality, the logic that extends the narrative paradigm, entails a reconceptualization of knowledge, one that permits the possibility of wisdom. Right. So again, getting back to that modernist kind of dichotomy between facts and values, the kind of knowledge that goes along with just strict fact is certainty, right? And it's just kind of like rationality. What about the logic or the kind of knowledge that comes with, the other side of the ledger, the values ledger, right? He wants to sort of argue for wisdom. What we need is wisdom, not just accurate information and a true objective knowledge, but we need wisdom. We need the ability to make judgments. We need to be able to kind of understand values and how they're present anywhere, right? Not just in literature, as Burke talked about, not just in, public controversies and situations like Bitzer's talking about, but even in the places that we might least expect to find human values. Science, the discourse of science by scientists, right? So it's quite an endeavor he's taking on here. And he's saying, essentially, what he ends up showing is, you can analyze a piece of scientific discourse using this narrative rationality or the logic of the narrative paradigm by boiling it down to 2 particular features here. This is kicking in on 22. At the top, he says, I agree with Prelli that rhetoric and science are compatible. Rhetoric and science are compatible because scientific discourse practices are governed by a rhetorical logic. This is just a setup still, sorry. He says, the next paragraph, there's no question that scientific discourse practices are rhetorical. Whether involving the specialized audience of scientists or the generalized audience of the public. In both instances, rhetorical motives and rhetorical means are at work. The desire to get, this is all pretty crucial, the desire to gain adherence, adaptation to audience constraint, that's Bitzer pretty much, and the use of strategic persuasive symbols, including charts, graphs, pictures, all that stuff's rhetorical. Justification to convince a specialized audience and translation for a generalized audience are both rhetorical doings, practices. All of this stuff that's normal everyday practice for scientists is rhetoric, he's saying. So it's this really interesting kind of historical moment where after a couple hundred years of science, science, science over here and all that other crap over there, now we're flipping it. It's like a big judo flip, historically speaking, where now if values were below facts before, now facts are down here and values are up here in terms of priority, but also the understanding that like values are kind of everywhere percolating underneath, and that's what makes them primary, right? Doing science is a particular form of problem solving, having two interdependent phases, discovery and verification, right? Next page over. He wants to suggest that like, narrative paradigm helps open up our understanding of even scientific discourse beyond just the kind of like objectivist criteria for understanding it, right? Page 23, narrative rationality, revisited. So yeah, this is pretty clutch. 23 and 24 are, and 25 actually are key pages. Especially that first footnote, because there he sort of breaks down what he means by narrative rationality. It's a really interesting phrase, because when we think of narratives, we just think of like free-form stories, right? Just like you made it up, it's fiction, right? But rationality gets to like more technical, scientific kinds of like this rational process, which is streamlined and efficient and, very mechanical kind of idea. So this idea of a narrative rationality is like, what is the logic of narratives rhetorically speaking, that win over audiences. So that whole chunk on 23, that top chunk is clutch. He says toward the bottom, these elements appear not only in legal, philosophical, political, and historical discourse, they're also common in aesthetic, religious, and scientific texts as well. Basically saying, like, after Burke, everything's rhetoric, everything's rhetorical all the way down. Whether it's a church sermon or a scientific conference or a paper and coming out of a specialized technical community or whatever. It's all human. It's all got values underneath it. And our job as students, critics, analysts of rhetoric is to try to get at that stuff. So he says, most importantly, however, they are formed as clear-cut inferential or aesthetic expressions, and whenever they arise, they will be value-laden. That is why narrative rationality includes tests of values and reasons. Humans are valuing and reasoning beings. We're not just reasoning beings, which we are, but that's not our basic, fundamental aspect. We are also valuing, moralizing, feeling creatures, right? And we've got the rhetorical theorists at this time were starting to really get serious about that idea that had been rejected for so long. All right, so at the bottom there, he says the two major considerations in narrative rationality are coherence and fidelity. And he breaks those down a little bit further, right? So next page over is where he gets all the particulars. And he's going to spend his time on fidelity. But, what's coherent? Is a text coherent, narratively speaking? Well, there's three ways of knowing it. The first is concern for argumentative or structural coherence. Second, concern for material coherence. And third, concern for character-ological coherence, right? And I just noted in the margins here, the first one is the text itself internally. Is the text internally coherent in terms of its own argumentative and structures and organizational, right? Just on its face, is it coherent? Material coherence is the text in relation to other texts like it, right? Does it cohere with what other people are saying? Is it sort of is it verifiable in that outward sense? And then, of course, the character of the speaker, the ethos, essentially. So the first two are kind of logos considerations, and the third is more ethos consideration. That's coherence. He's more interested in fidelity. So he says, testing for fidelity in the middle of 24 is not merely an assessment of formal or informal soundness in thinking. Since values inform reasons, it is necessary, indispensable, to weigh values in discourse to determine their worthiness as a basis of belief and action. Testing for fidelity for the truth qualities not revealed in considering matters of coherence then entails 2 lines of assessment. Weighing the elements of a message usually regarded as its reasoning, and weighing the values it explicitly or implicitly conveys, right? So fidelity, the first one, is basically that kind of objective, outward truth quality, right? Is it accurate? Is it precise? Is it repeatable, and so on, right? So those are all the sort of standard objective ways of deciding if something is. Fidelity is like faithful, right? If you have an infidelity, it's like you're not faithful to your partner or whatever, right? And so fidelity is it faithful to reality? Is it faithful to what's come before, and so on? That's all the rational side. That's all kind of fact objective stuff. But the second one is the key one. That's the one he's most interested in, right? So the second one is weighing the values it explicitly or implicitly conveys. That's really the nub of this whole business of analyzing a discourse narratively, is to be looking for those values that are either implicit or explicit. So he says in the next paragraph, in the second instance, one tries to answer the following questions related to values. What are the implicit and explicit values in the story? Are the values appropriate to the nature of the decisions or beliefs that the story concerns? And so on and so on and so on. All right, so he then provides an analysis, it's really interesting, of this paper by Watson and Crick, mid-20th century, where the human DNA strand had been mapped. We've figured out the secrets, the genetic coding secrets of life itself, right? And so you hard pressed to find a more like high level scientific paper than that one. And so he's going into that essay, that paper, and basically conducting a narrative analysis of it to see this business of like the knowledge of that and the knowledge of how, which they cover thoroughly, but ends up, and this is just a quickie summary of his analysis, is like the paper does a nice job of giving us the objective coherence and fidelity, but what it doesn't really give us is that value question, right? The knowledge of whether. And so that's sort of how he ends up. It's interesting because his analysis is not so much a critique of how they failed to be objective. He's basically saying like, yeah, they're doing what they should have done, scientifically speaking. They just didn't get to the business of whether, right? So I don't know if you've ever heard about this. I got to wrap up here. It's the is-ought problem. You ever heard of the is-ought, right? So just a description of how things are or what is one thing, but then a discussion of what ought to be or what ought to happen is a kind of another thing, right? But they're related. We have what is, and then we have what ought, what we would like, or what we want, or what should be, or whatever, our sense of how things ought to go. But we also have that which is, right? The objectivist knowledge of that and how is the knowledge of is, that which is, right? It's just sort of like, all right, so here's the human genome, or the DNA strand, or whatever. That's what it is. And the papers, as Fisher's noting, is the paper, does that fine, right? But it does not address that sort of value question of ought. What ought we do with this, or ought we do anything? So let's see here. Page 28 is the other kind of last key moment. And in the middle of that top paragraph, he says, impossible to the values, their discourse were particularly pertinent questions of life. Question of the appropriateness of the explicit and implicit values of the message, the consequences of endorsing the values, and the vitality of the enterprise itself. So these are ways of asking questions about values, in anything, right? Because we ought to be able to, essentially, right? So the next paragraph, about 4 lines in, it says they do not go beyond what exists. The Watson and Crick don't go beyond what exists or what is thought to exist, even when tied to the traditional values of pragmatism, efficiency, workability, and success. They do not fully inform the mind to the knowledge of whether, right? That's the ought question. At the end of that paragraph, these values include, as suggested earlier, justice, happiness, and humanity. The bedrock value of praxial consciousness, I believe, is love. That is an abiding concern for the welfare of being of others. So his point is basically like scientists are humans as well. And scientists don't really get to kind of play this like, I'm just a scientist. All I'm trying to do is get at the objective truth. It's like, no. You're also a human. You're a citizen. You have to be sort of aware of the values that kind of go along with this, right? So, because of the discovery of Watson and Crick, we now have, biologists and genetic corporations and biogen companies and so on have mapped the genome and have picked it apart and are now, creating new kinds of life essentially out of their discoveries, right? So all the controversy around GMOs is sort of getting back to this discovery. And as someone who's really interested in food and ecology and sort of, how we eat and live and so on, it's sort of like, is this a good thing that we now are able to kind of like create chickens by like, bringing in some DNA from a flower or a frog or a fish? Or, it's like, what's life, right? So these are human questions. These are value questions. These are questions about whether or ought and so on. Which isn't to say that we shouldn't be like inquiring and investigating and scientifically curious and all the rest of it. But the point here is to like not see so far apart the business of the fact, the objective knowledge on the one hand, and the ought, the values, the how we want to live, the compassion for one another, and whether or not this thing is actually good, whether, like drones, like just because we can doesn't mean we should. Underneath narrative paradigm is human values, and the narrative, we get a nice little sampling here of like how it is one can actually use or think about the narrative paradigm, looking at coherence, looking at fidelity, and thinking about all the kind of little rhetorical moves that are made within a given text to secure an audience, to create that adherence. He uses the word adherence a number of times, which is actually a very Perelman kind of word. As I've been saying, I'm here if you want to chat. I know some of these readings are a little weird and tricky and concepts can be new and challenging. Please don't just feel like I'm not around to talk things through with you. I do have time that I can like set up video chats and we can, we can just, or even just a phone chat. We can just talk about ideas and concepts. I'm into it. All right, so good luck out there. Hope you enjoy and talk next week.